Hello. Hello to everybody. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for coming to this amazing venue. I don't think I've ever done anything in quite such a sort of stunning space before. But it's great that you've all come. My name's Richard Colebourn. I'm the Bureau Chief for the BBC for Europe. And I'm very pleased to have with me Fergal Keane for a sort of conversation today at lunchtime. Fergal, if you follow the BBC at all on TV or radio, probably needs no introduction whatsoever. But for anybody who doesn't, I think it's fair to say that Fergal is one of the most preeminent foreign correspondents in Britain, the most accomplished, award-winning author of many books, and has been sort of on the scene at the kind of key conflicts, the key moments of our time from the early 1990s right through to today, from Rwanda, from South Africa under apartheid, and then after the Congo, Hong Kong, Myanmar, wars in Afghanistan, the Balkans, Iraq, Middle East, and so on, and up to Ukraine in recent years. But I think it's fair to say that Fergal's career has taken a toll on himself, and as a result of that, he's published quite recently a fantastic book, The Madness, a memoir of war, fear, and PTSD, which is really a kind of a reckoning of a career and the toll of such exposure to conflict, such exposure to the sort of the horrors of the world. It's incredibly sort of raw, honest. I've never read anything quite like it in terms of the honesty that comes through from it. And it's a book that, you know, has a lot, obviously, to say to any journalists, anybody working in the field, but also beyond that, a lot for anybody interested or touched by addiction, alcoholism, trauma, and the sort of the understandings we increasingly have about trauma and what makes perhaps some people more susceptible to others than others to trauma. So, you know, it's a great basis for this conversation. But I wanted to start with Fergal by talking about January 2020. You were the BBC's Africa editor. You know, I think you'd been doing the job for a couple of years by that point. And in a way, and you talk about this in the book, you know, your hope was that the role would give you a space to get away a bit from sort of frontline conflict reporting, to do sort of wider focus on different stories in Africa. But then in January 2020, very publicly, the BBC came out on your behalf and said you were going to step down as a result of a diagnosis of PTSD and would step back from that role. It created a lot of attention in the media in Britain. There's a lot of reporting around it. Just to start, can you talk a little bit about that moment, whether you wanted it to be public in the way that it was, what was the reaction to it?
I guess I reached a point, just to fill in a bit of the background, January 2020, the previous period, maybe 5 or 6 years, I'd been battling with recurring episodes of PTSD, and I was just worn out. I was worn out, and I recognized that the life I was living wasn't sustainable. And I also came to the point where I didn't want to feel ashamed of what was wrong with me. And I said, why not, you know, Robert Lowell, the poet, has a great line in his poem Epilogue where he says, yet why not say what happened? And we're journalists. We're in the business of telling truths, or should be. Why would I step back from a job with no apparent reason and lead to a lot of speculation? Why not just say the truth? Not least because, I mean, I did this for myself first and foremost, but because so many friends and colleagues I knew were struggling with the consequences of the conflicts that they had covered, and critically, the conflicts within themselves. Because that's a very important thing to understand, you know. I went to the wars, I became a correspondent of conflict, in large part because of the demons inside me. You know, it made me perfectly suited to war zones. You know, the kind of childhood I had, the fact that I was, you know, had a very addictive nature, I was ready-made for it. So to come back, I didn't feel any shame. Nobody should, in saying publicly, this is what's up with me. And I went ahead and did it. and came out, but the problem didn't go away. So, in fact, it got worse.
Yeah. And how did you find the reaction of colleagues and the wider public and the media at that moment?
Well, the great thing about nowadays is that you're a 24-hour wonder, if even that, you know. There was 24 hours of people noticing it and sending messages, and everybody supportive. And then it moved on, which is exactly the way I wanted it. It did feed into a broader discussion in journalism, not just in journalism, in the international aid community as well, about the kind of pressures that face people in the field. And I was happy about that. But in terms of focus on me, I'm glad it swiftly moved on. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the book obviously is a sort of, it runs through your career and the kind of continuous conflict reporting, and then obviously kind of goes back into your childhood, goes back into you sort of, I suppose, searching for answers as to how you found yourself in the situation that you did find yourself in. Was that a process that was going on before 2020? To what extent was that journey and the book prompted by 2020 or actually kind of came about much earlier on?
I think it's been going on for decades, trying to understand what it is that motivates me. Now, you often hear the phrase war junkie. I would never apply that to anybody. You know, I think it's just a reductive, narrow way of seeing anybody. But yes, there was an element of addiction in, you know, my attraction to being in places where you felt so intensely alive. You know, really alive. That's the great kind of paradox of what we do, is it's in the close presence of death that you feel this aliveness. But I was also driven by curiosity about human nature. I'm a passionate history fan. I'm a passionate fan of examining the aftermath of empires. That's because I grew up on an island where we were dealing with the consequences of imperialism. And so all of those things came together to make me go to the places that I did. It wasn't just one thing. But the consequence of continually returning was a breaking down of my mental health. And I thought, you know, and I'd say this when I meet younger war correspondents and photographers, and I see them full of enthusiasm, and it's wonderful, you know, to have that enthusiasm, that energy and that drive. But I can't stop myself now looking 20, 30 years down the road at the damage that's sustained. And that's what happened to me. It just, you know, going back again and again and again. And you don't notice that your defenses start to crumble until bang, you're in a room in Sudan and you're interviewing someone and they crack up in front of you, and you're suddenly thinking, what have I done to this person? I'm asking them to recount the horror of witnessing the gang rape of a dead woman, and the guy just falls apart in front of me. And that was the specific trigger to step down from the job as Africa editor, you know, and I couldn't deal with it, and I stepped down from the job. And then I ended up, within a year, having a breakdown and going into psychiatric hospital. And that's, you know, I'd been in psychiatric hospital twice before with PTSD, but this breakdown felt really extreme. And it's sobering. You know, you're in a locked ward. You can't go out without somebody accompanying you. And you're lost. I was completely lost. I didn't know who I was. It was almost like being in this childlike state where people are feeding you medication and 3 meals a day. And they're watching over you. They check your room 3 times a night to see what's going on. There's no privacy. But it was, you know, I could look back and I know that it was what I needed, but it was so lonely. And, you know, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. I wouldn't. Now, let me just enter a very important caveat. not everyone who goes to the wars comes out like that. We're all built differently, and I stress this is one person's story. We are all made up of very different psychological material, background, childhood, and you know, what happened to me was what happened to me. But I do see friends who are going through the same thing, and I see younger people who are showing signs of the damage that will manifest itself many years later.
And you, as you absolutely say, everybody is different, but you do talk in the book about a sense that people's childhoods are important, and a sense that you met many colleagues struggling with PTSD, particularly during the 90s and earlier periods when it really wasn't talked about or recognised in the same way, and you saw common threads in terms of people's stories and their childhoods.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
The number of people that I've met in conflict zones who are journalists or aid workers who come from fucked up childhoods, it's quite astonishing. I mean, nobody's ever done a survey as far as I'm aware, but I think it would yield, you know, it would be quite shocking. Now, if you think about it, is it surprising? If you grow up in an environment of conflict, as I did, where anything can happen and usually did. I grew up in a violent alcoholic home, and you know, there was a constant need to read the room, to watch what the adults in your life were doing, to look at the expressions on their faces, to be able to tell when the atmosphere was changing and to get offside. These are wonderful gifts if you decide to go into the work of a war correspondent. Fantastic. Also, in not quite so negatively, I think you develop, when you're around a lot of suffering as a child, your own, but also of the adults in your life, people who are struggling with addiction, as it was in my case, you can develop an empathy. You know, it's not necessarily the case. Some people go the other way and become very isolated and emotionally isolated and cold. But in my case, I developed an empathy with people who were struggling, who were suffering. And that was a valuable thing. But I would just say that childhood, the specific circumstances of my childhood, helped push me towards it. And also, when I began to research the longer history of my family in Ireland, I discovered my grandmother had been a guerrilla fighter, and that she had suffered from PTSD and had been treated. I found her military file in the archives, and it showed how back in the 1960s the ghosts of the Irish Revolution had come back to her, and led to a long struggle with depression, which I had witnessed as a child but I couldn't understand. And we were not living in those days, this was Ireland in the late 60s, early 70s, in a time when there was any kind of space in our culture to express emotional pain. The war, the revolution was, you know, this myth, this heroic myth. And it was largely a male myth, I have to say, which had no room for people like my grandmother who sacrificed so much.
And then, I mean, the book, it feels like a sort of a drumbeat as it goes through decade after decade, the conflicts you're covering, your exposure to horrific scenes, the toll that was taking on you personally. You get the sense as the book goes on that there are friends and colleagues who have some sense of the price you're paying, the toll you're paying. There are moments in the book where it's clear that people at the BBC are sort of intervening, stopping, take a break. I mean, there's one point, I think it's in sort of 1999, you sort of run through a list of your visits in sort of spring 1999, and there's sort of 5 war zones or something, and you describe it as the book's title, Madness. When you look back, there were clearly people who were sort of there attempting to help, but I suspect for lots of readers of the book who aren't from the profession, they would be sort of screaming, why were you allowed to go? Why, you know, why I mean, do you feel that? Do you feel that there are people who should have stopped you, or could they have stopped you, or is the sort of compulsion so great?
No force on earth, I think, could have stopped me. And I think yes, there are huge responsibilities on organisations, journalistic organisations, to take care of their people. Okay, but it's a very difficult line to walk. If somebody wants to go, is good at what they do, is determined to be there, I'd have probably left the BBC and worked for someone else if they'd stopped me. I was very, very driven, and I can look back and see that it was a form of madness. Of course it was. As I say, the spell in psychiatric hospital, the last one, wasn't the first, you know. I'd managed to quit drinking about 25 years ago now. So I'd given up that addiction, but I was not able to give up the compulsion of returning again and again right to the very front line of war.
And you describe it as an addiction, and you talk about the idea of feeling alive when you're there, but talk a little bit more for people who perhaps have no desire whatsoever to go anywhere near a front line.
You're perfectly sane. That's the good news.
What is the nature of that addiction? You know, is it about adrenaline? Is it about testing yourself? I mean,
oh, look, it's a whole load of things.
Yeah.
You know, when there's a big war, it's the biggest story in the world. I think it's the absolutely natural journalistic reaction to want to be there, okay? Be there, be doing that draft of history that people talk about. And yeah, this is a business with big ego involved. And you don't stay at the front of the game without considerable ego, without sharp elbows. It's pretty brutal, and those of us who are in it know it, okay? You know, I sometimes, and of course, it's really important, and I feel it inside in my gut, the idea of telling people things that they don't know. I felt that very strongly in Rwanda, getting the story out to the world. But I also acknowledge the ambition, the ego, the drive, the kind of warm glow that comes with getting a big award, and the herograms telling you what a great guy you are. And it's the only addiction, you know, where people actually praise you for it. Like if you pass out drunk in a pool of vomit, okay, nobody's going to say, "Fuck it, that was great. That was a great one." Or they find you in a room with a needle in your arm. You know, "That was a great overdose. Well done." But you know, stick yourself on the front line again and again, and they'll say, "Oh, amazing." And if you're lucky enough to come home, you can collect the prize. And if you're not, they'll give you a big funeral, and your friends will read poetry, and people will sing songs, and then you'll be forgotten.
Yeah. And so, look, after 2020, and then sort of the treatment you then went into, you know, you have been going back to conflict zones. You've been in Ukraine. You've been in the Middle East repeatedly. You're going back to the Middle East soon. You have been sort of trying to draw this line between not being on the front lines at the sort of higher risk locations, but telling the stories of people coming out of Ukraine, telling the stories of people inside Gaza. I mean, one of the things I'm very conscious of, we talk a lot about sort of vicarious trauma in newsrooms now. We talk about the idea that you don't have to be in the middle of the bomb blast necessarily to experience traumatic effects, the testimonies, the video, the images. How do you balance that for you? The sort of sense, it's not just about the physical risk of being shot at, it's also exposure to trauma in other ways.
Yeah, it's like an alcoholic keeping a seat at the bar. He mightn't be drinking, but he's keeping a seat at the bar. I guess it's a work in progress. So I'm not going under shell fire anymore. I'm not around where the snipers are. But yes, I'm still in a, you know, if I'm in Kyiv and interviewing the survivors of massacre in Bucha, you know, you are in the presence of trauma. I would call it a kind of, quote St. Augustine, an Augustinian progress. Lord, make me perfect, but not yet. And I'm, you know, yeah, I'm struggling to come away from, to fully come away from what has been the mission, the obsession of my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's one little bit, you mentioned the example of Sudan which was very powerful, and the sort of moment that kind of prompted your decisions in 2020. And I want to read a little bit of it of your experience of interviewing the ambulance driver in Sudan,
Yes.
who then has a sort of breakdown in front of you. You write, "I have ignited great distress in this man by interviewing him. I have not manufactured the horrors in his head, but I have summoned them into a public space. Having done so, I left him and returned home, as I've left so many others." And you do reflect in the book as well about the relationship between the journalist and the interviewee to some extent. And I just wonder to what extent your own experiences through your career and the toll on you and your understanding about trauma had changed at all your feeling about the responsibility of the journalist or not, you know, in the moment, interviewing people themselves who are obviously going through appalling situations and traumatizing incidents.
I would say two things about that. I think I've become much more conscious of the way I interact with people, and indeed of the people that I would ask to be interviewed. So probably a lot more conservative about that. So that's as a result of my own experiences. And my filmmaking partner, Alice Doyar, who doesn't come from a news background, interestingly enough, comes from documentaries, has also had a major impact on that in saying, whoa, this person is distressed. I don't think we can, you know, I don't think we should do that interview today, or we shouldn't push this. And yes, there is a great responsibility, and it raises for me the larger question of, you know, continuing to do this. How longer? It goes back to your last question. How much longer? I don't know, but it feels, I don't know. It feels like I'm maybe moving towards a different path. Quite what it is, I'm not sure, but it will be revealed. And the major thing is that even sitting here talking to you, okay, can feel very self-indulgent when I think of all of the people who are stuck in conflict zones or post-conflict zones, whether that's Belfast, Rwanda, whether Iraq, Ukraine, who don't have access to therapy, who don't have a means of escape. And I've had all of that. I've had a big corporation that backed me, and also journalists who don't have big corporations backing them, freelancers who are suffering from this. So all I'm concerned to do is acknowledge that, but hopefully create or contribute to a conversation about how we can support people.
Absolutely. And do you still share the same sense of mission that you had when you started in your career about the value of the work?
Yeah. And I'm inspired. The thing that really inspires me is actually the young people that I'm meeting on the road, because they're more idealistic than ever. I think they're far more idealistic than we were. You hear all this bullshit about, oh, the golden age of journalism is gone. No, it's not. It's much better now. It's far more accountable. When I started out as a foreign correspondent, you could go to countries in Africa, countries in Asia, tell your version of their story. It would be broadcast in Britain, and nobody in the country would have a chance to see it or to answer back or to hold you to account for what you were writing. And that's changed. It's been wonderful. You call it decolonizing or de-imperializing of information, but the more of that, the better. And I do think that there is, for all the worry we have, and there's a lot of this festival has been devoted to looking at issues of fake news. Fake news was always there, always. It's just disseminated far more widely now. But critically, the people challenging it, whether that's through OSINT or something like BBC Verified, you know, the sort of counterfight is gathering pace and will continue to be powerful.
And so to wrap up, what then would be your message to a sort of 20-year-old, 25-year-old future foreign correspondent who absolutely shares the passion that you had then at that age and still have now, the same drive, the same ambition, given your experiences, given your exploration of trauma? What would be your message to them about self-awareness, I suppose, protecting themselves? Well,
to those of you who are sitting in the audience who are at the beginning of such a career or in the early stages of it, there is no point in me saying to you, don't go to the war zones. It would be hypocritical given what I've done. But take care of yourself. And you do, you're from a much more emotionally literate generation. And that's fantastic. And one which is not, you're not afraid to talk about feelings and not afraid to go to therapy. And I would just say that when you feel the pressure getting to you, don't be afraid to step back. Take time out. Listen to yourself. Take responsibility for your own mental health. Because if you're waiting for editors to do it, good luck to you. What they see is someone who'll go into the field and get them great material. And they're dealing with lots of people. It's not out of malice, but they're dealing with a lot of people, and a lot of ambitious people. And so it's about finding the courage within yourself to say, actually, my mental health should come first. And I'm not going to be any use to anyone or any organization if I break. And so take the time out when you need it. Easier to say if you're a staff journalist in a big organization. I get that. Much more difficult if you're a freelance.
Great. Thank you, Fergal. We've got to wrap up now. Thank you very much for your time, for your honesty. It's great to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I know that there is very appropriately a session coming up on Gaza next, so stay for that. But thank you very much.